Moscow, early December 1982. Outside the window, early dusk. Evening lights are just starting to flicker to life, glowing over the snow-covered streets. In the very heart of the Soviet capital, nestled in a nondescript multi-story building on Novinsky Boulevard, sits the Embassy of the United States of America. On the surface, just another building, watched over by police officers, clerks, and gray-coated men. But few know that on the 7th floor lies a place like no other. A small, unremarkable room stripped of unnecessary details. This is where the CIA's Moscow station is located, the nerve center of American intelligence in the very heart of the Soviet Empire. On December 7th, a car pulls out from the embassy parking lot. Inside are 2 men and 2 women. On the surface, a group of American diplomats heading to a birthday party. At least, that's what those eavesdropping on embassy calls believed. And those eavesdroppers, of course, were the KGB. Surveilling American diplomats was routine. The KGB recorded everything: who they talked to, where they went, even what they ordered at cafes. But this time, they were walking straight into a trap. It was a covert operation codenamed Jack in the Box, a reference to the children's toy where a clown suddenly pops out of a box. Only this time, the clown was a CIA agent, and the unsuspecting audience was the Soviet secret police. The car with the 4 diplomats rolls onto the street. In the front passenger seat, a man dressed as an American, but underneath he's wearing the disguise of an elderly Soviet pensioner. Behind him sits a woman holding a large birthday cake. But the cake is not a cake. It's a complex mechanical device, spring-loaded, built to create the illusion that someone is still sitting in the car. At one intersection, just out of sight of the trailing KGB car, the driver slows down. The door opens. The CIA agent leaps out, already dressed as a Soviet old man, and quickly blends into the crowd. Before the door even fully shuts, the woman in the back places the cake on the seat and activates the mechanism. A lifelike dummy appears in the agent's place. When the KGB regains visual contact, there are still 4 people in the car. The illusion worked. The CIA had just vanished in front of the KGB's eyes. But this story is only the beginning of a much deeper, more dramatic game. Ahead lie dozens of secret meetings, codes, cameras the size of a battery, betrayals, poison, and don't forget to hit like and stay tuned to find out who this person is, the one who would deal the greatest blow to the Soviet military machine in the entire history of the Cold War. To be a spy in the Soviet Union wasn't just risky, it was nearly suicidal. In a country where a citizen couldn't even move freely within their own district without a passport, a foreign spy had little chance of avoiding detection, often before passing even a single note. Surveillance was total. Police officers, building superintendents, even janitors. Many secretly worked for the KGB. Phones were tapped. Many apartments were bugged. As Muscovites used to joke, even the walls had ears. The CIA knew this. That's why, for a long time, the world's most powerful intelligence agency couldn't recruit a single, high-level source inside the USSR without the risk of being deceived or killed. As one CIA officer confessed, trying to recruit an agent inside the Soviet Union was like planting a spy on Mars. And even those who broke through the Iron Curtain often met tragic ends. So when, in 1977, an unknown man approached an American at a gas station in Moscow and handed over a note, the CIA's first assumption was, it's a trap. It sounded too good to be true. But the truth was only just beginning. Moscow, 1977. It looked like an ordinary day in a big city. Snow, queues, gray skies. But at a gas station in the city center, a place often visited by diplomats from foreign embassies, an event unfolded that would eventually spark one of the most extraordinary spy stories of the Cold War. A man approached a car belonging to the American embassy. Behind the wheel sat Robert Fulton, head of the CIA's Moscow station. The stranger looked completely unremarkable. A coat, a hat, a dark folder in his hands. He leaned in toward the window and said in broken English, "Are you American? I need to talk to you." Then, a quick apology, a switch to Russian, a few words, and a piece of paper was placed into Fulton's hand. A moment later, the man vanished as quietly as he had appeared. On the note were just a few short sentences in Russian. The author was requesting a confidential meeting with a representative of the U.S. Embassy. Attached was a hand-drawn map showing the exact location for a secret rendezvous. Fulton immediately relayed the information to CIA headquarters in Langley. The response there: caution and skepticism. It could be a setup, a baited trap laid by the KGB. The decision was clear. Do not respond, do not make contact. But the stranger didn't give up. Weeks passed, and then another attempt. Once again, he approached an American vehicle, another letter, and then another. Each time, more details emerged. He gradually revealed his identity. His name was Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev. He worked at a top-secret defense research institute specializing in radio engineering. And he had direct access to materials of immense value to the United States. In his letters, he included his home and work phone numbers, address, names of family members. Such a level of openness didn't fit the typical tactics of the Soviet security services. The CIA began to realize, if this was a provocation, it was far too obvious. More likely, this was a genuine opportunity. Langley made a decision: accept the contact. The man who had spent months risking his life to reach out to the CIA was given the codename Sphere. Thus began one of the most dangerous, valuable, and far-reaching intelligence operations in Soviet history. The story of an engineer who would become the Soviet Union's enemy from within his very own office. The first contact was arranged via a public payphone, the standard approach for high-risk operations to avoid wiretaps. The mission was assigned to John Gill, a CIA officer fluent in Russian. To avoid suspicion, he and his wife attended a performance at the Bolshoi Theater. During intermission, John left the hall, while his wife kept a Soviet colleague, who was secretly a KGB agent, distracted with polite conversation. Gill approached a payphone and made a short call. He introduced himself to the agent as the person who had received his letters. He spoke cautiously, without revealing too much. Contact was established. Gill returned to the theater as if nothing had happened. His wife continued chatting, and the Soviet colleague noticed nothing unusual. During the next contact, the CIA provided Tolkachev with detailed instructions: how to communicate with the Americans without drawing attention. Everything was disguised as innocent correspondence. An American tourist writing a letter to her grandfather in the US. On the back of the letter, Tolkachev was to write classified information using special carbon copy paper and invisible ink. The code he used was so advanced that only CIA cryptographers could decode it. Even if the KGB opened the envelope, all they would see was a personal message with nothing suspicious. To reduce the risk of interception, the CIA created a cover identity. Tolkachev would send his letters to a fake address in the US, one secretly controlled by the CIA. This system allowed for fast communication without direct contact. But Tolkachev wanted more. He wanted face-to-face meetings. For him, it was a matter of trust. Personal contact gave him confidence that he was being listened to, believed, and that he was not alone in this dangerous game. Although the Americans typically avoided high-risk engagements, they were willing to make an exception for an agent like Sphere. The deeper the CIA got into its cooperation with Tolkachev, the clearer it became. He wasn't just a valuable informant. He was an ideological enemy of the Soviet regime. His motives went far beyond money or the dream of escaping to the West. He wasn't looking to emigrate, nor did he crave a luxurious life. He was driven by a deeply personal hatred for the system that had destroyed his loved ones' lives and shattered his faith in justice. Tolkachev's decision to work with the CIA was profoundly influenced by the tragic history of his wife Natalia's family. Her mother had been arrested and executed in the 1930s as an enemy of the people, simply for having a relative abroad. Her father was sent to a labor camp for 10 years. Natalia herself grew up in an orphanage. She carried deep trauma and a clear understanding. The Soviet state was not protection, it was danger. Tolkachev knew her story well. Her refusal to sign ideological declarations at work, Her habit of reading underground samizdat literature, her critical view of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Her quiet resistance only strengthened his conviction that the system deserved to be struck back, and he knew how to do it, with documents, with knowledge. He didn't write manifestos, didn't march in protests. He worked, and that work gave him access to top-level military secrets. He began passing to the CIA hundreds of blueprints, diagrams, and technical reports. Particularly valuable were materials on radar systems, guidance technology, missile programs, and plans for the development of the Su-27 fighter jet. This was the technical lifeblood of the Soviet military-industrial complex, and it started flowing west. At first, Tolkachev painstakingly copied everything by hand. Diagrams, tables, formulas. He would sneak documents out from the classified archives under his coat, photograph them at home, and return them before anyone noticed. But it was time-consuming and exhausting. At his request, the CIA supplied him with special cameras. The first was Molly, a tiny device the size of a matchbox. Later came an upgraded model named Troll, and even a backup Pentax camera. With these tools, Tolkachev's productivity soared. He began delivering not dozens but hundreds of crystal-clear, highly technical photographs. He sometimes even photographed documents inside the institute's restroom when smuggling them out was too risky. At their first meeting, he asked for 10,000 rubles, a symbolic gesture, a sign of serious intent. But he soon realized his worth. Tolkachev began demanding real money, not rubles, but US dollars. The CIA agreed, $200,000 upfront, then $300,000 annually. The money was transferred to a foreign bank account, where it eventually totaled nearly $2 million, an unheard-of figure for a spy. Yet most of it remained only a number on paper. In the USSR, even in Moscow, such money couldn't be freely spent. Tolkachev kept some cash hidden in his apartment, tucked away in a storage shelf. The CIA also provided him with hard-to-find items: foreign books, razors, medicine, office supplies, vinyl records for his son. They even gave him a cyanide capsule in case he was ever caught. At first, the CIA resisted, fearing he might use it prematurely or that the KGB might find it. But eventually, they trusted him. By then, Adolf Tolkachev's espionage had already shifted the balance in the technological race between the two superpowers. And still, he continued, precise, cold, methodical. And he still believed he was doing the right thing. Beginning in 1980, Tolkachev's cooperation with the CIA reached a new level: regular in-person meetings with handlers. Initially, these were conducted by John Gill, an experienced CIA officer whom Tolkachev trusted. Gill knew how to listen, never pressured, and most importantly, provided the calm and reassurance the agent known as Sphere needed. The meetings took place mostly in the evenings, far from crowds, at pre-selected locations with code names like Valera or Nina. Before every meeting, Gill would thoroughly check for surveillance. Sometimes he deliberately left the USSR on an official trip and returned ahead of schedule, before the KGB knew he was back. This created a window of a few precious hours for safe contact. Later, David Rolfe replaced Gill, a younger officer operating under deep cover. To meet Tolkachev, Rolfe disguised himself as a maintenance worker, applied makeup, exited through a service entrance, took a tram, entered random shops, changed his route several times, all to shake any possible tail. Each meeting required over an hour of KGB evasion tactics. But there was no other way. A single mistake could mean the agent's death and the end of the operation. Yet the risks continued to grow. In 1981 to 82, the research institute where Tolkachev worked tightened its security. Now, in order to access classified documents, one had to surrender their pass, which was also needed just to enter the building. This made his previous method, sneaking documents out during lunch, impossible. Tolkachev found a workaround. He persuaded a colleague inside the archive to grant him access without a pass. When asked if he wasn't taking too big a risk, he simply replied, "Everything here is dangerous." But the danger came even closer when one day, his wife Natalia discovered CIA equipment at home: cameras, instructions, and hidden materials. Tolkachev didn't deny it. He confessed and promised to stop. But that wasn't true. He didn't stop. In 1983, he was summoned by his institute's management. There, he accidentally overheard part of a phone conversation. A call from a security officer reporting the voice was curious, the tone concerned. And the topic? Documents that Tolkachev had just recently passed to the CIA. From that moment, he carried the cyanide capsule in his mouth every day, to work, to meetings, even to his supervisor's office. Every day could be his last. Everything changed in 1984, when a true betrayal occurred. Edward Lee Howard, a former CIA officer once assigned to Moscow operations, had been dismissed after failing a polygraph and due to alcohol problems. Bitter and disgruntled, Howard still had access to some sensitive information about operations in the USSR. While traveling in Europe, Howard contacted Soviet representatives and sold what he knew. His most valuable offering, the existence of a CIA mole inside the Soviet military-industrial complex. He may not have known Tolkachev's name, but he knew enough. The KGB now knew who to look for. Howard eventually fled the US, defected to the USSR, and lived in Moscow until his death in 2002. In his memoirs, he denied any role in Tolkachev's capture. But within the CIA, no one doubted it. Howard had betrayed Sphere, and that could mean only one thing. Time was running out. Spring 1985. The silence surrounding Tolkachev worried the CIA more than any open confrontation. He began missing scheduled meetings. He stopped responding to signals. Multiple attempts were made to re-establish contact, all in vain. At Langley, fears of the worst began to grow. Eventually, the decision was made to try one last contact attempt following the highest security protocols. The internal code name was Jack in the Box. A CIA officer was to meet Tolkachev at a prearranged location. Tolkachev never came. Instead, a trap. A few days later, as he was returning from the countryside with his wife, Adolf Georgievich saw a traffic officer flag their car down. But the moment he stepped out, men in plain clothes tackled him, threw him into a van, and sped off. These weren't traffic police. They were KGB agents. A search of his apartment followed. Everything was found. Miniature cameras, hidden cash stashes, CIA instructions, communications tools, and the poison capsule. There was no doubt anymore. They had captured the West's top spy in the USSR. At the same time, a US diplomat arrived at the meeting spot for the failed rendezvous. As he approached the familiar vehicle, KGB agents sprang from hiding, tackled him, and took him to Lubyanka prison. He was found with spy equipment, cash, and encoded materials. He was declared persona non grata and expelled from the USSR that same night. The case against Tolkachev was overwhelming and indisputable. There was no chance of escape. The trial took place in 1986, behind closed doors. The verdict was unsurprising: death by execution. Soviet media officially announced that Adolf Tolkachev had been sentenced to death for espionage and treason. Before his execution, he was granted a final visit with his son. In their last conversation, the father apologized. His son replied, "You have nothing to apologize for." Tolkachev's wife, Natalia, was sentenced to 3 years in prison for knowing and not reporting. After her release, she returned to Moscow. But her freedom was short-lived. She died of cancer in 1991, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Tolkachev's name became known in the West only after the USSR fell. At the CIA, he wasn't remembered simply as a spy who sold secrets, but as a man who, driven by personal conviction and hatred for a tyrannical regime, chose to strike at it from within. The intelligence he provided gave the United States an immeasurable edge in the arms race. Pentagon experts later estimated that his information saved the U.S. military-industrial complex tens of millions of dollars, and more importantly, enabled better preparedness in case of war. In Western intelligence, he came to be known as the billion-dollar spy. This was the story of an engineer who decided that silence is a crime, and information is a weapon. And armed with nothing but a camera, a sharp mind, and the belief that evil must be resisted, he shook the foundations of the Soviet war machine. At a time when the USSR appeared to be an unshakable monolith, this engineer became a crack in the system. He didn't wave banners or lead marches. He simply showed the world what he saw. And his truth, though it brought him betrayal, interrogation, and execution, helped change the course of history. This is not a story about espionage. This is the story of a man who proved that to challenge an empire of lies, sometimes all you need are eyes that see and a conscience that refuses to stay silent.